Faith. My name is Matt Wilson. I'm minister of Rohe Pavilion Church in Bourneville, Birmingham, and I'm delighted that you've joined me to explore how the Bible connects to our lives today. You may be someone who goes to church regularly, or you may not be, but this is about everyone who's interested to learn a little bit more about Jesus and who he was and what he said and how that can impact our lives. So the way in which Spilling Faith happens is that we'll listen to some scripture being read, then I'll give some comment on it, and then I'll leave you with a few questions to explore on your own or with a friend as you think about some of the ways in which God can connect with you. So I hope you'll be encouraged and enjoy being a part of this. So I'm going to hand over now to Esther, who's going to read from John chapter 5, 1 to 15.
The healing at the pool. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now there is in Jerusalem, near the sheep gate, a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here, a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralysed. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool. When the water is stirred, while I am trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." Then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat and walk." At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. The day on which this took place was a Sabbath. And so the Jewish leaders said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat." But he replied, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" So they asked him, "Who is this fellow who told you to pick up your mat and walk?" The man who was healed had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. Later, Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, "See, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jewish leaders that it was Jesus who had made him well.
A few days ago I was watching the first Premiership match to be shown live. 100 days without football because of COVID-19, but I got my opportunity to see my favourite team draw 0-0. It was a bit of a dull game. The most important and dramatic moment of the game actually happened at the beginning, as all the players knelt down on one knee in support and solidarity of the movement Black Lives Matter. In fact, on the back of their shirts they had that phrase, Black Lives Matter. Not the names of the players, but that phrase. It was a really important and significant moment. But on the front of their shirts they had the emblem NHS. And that's an incredible thing too, because it carried on that sense of gratitude and thankfulness that we all feel towards the NHS. We don't take it for granted. It is an incredible gift to each of us in our nation. Many people in shop windows or in houses with the rainbow emblem are also offering signs of thanks, and we know that the clap that went on for about 10 weeks, and there'll be other occasions to thank the NHS. I am so thankful to the NHS, as I'm sure you are. In this passage that we had read to us by Esther, there is no such thing as the NHS, no national health care service for people who are in desperate need to go to. Instead, back in the day, back in Jesus' day, there were other ways that people sought out help for physical or psychological or spiritual or emotional needs. And we read the story of this pool which is described a pool by the sheep gate in the middle of Jerusalem. Actually, it's a hidden place. There were 5 colonnades there, and people used to go to the water because they believed that the water had healing power. No such thing as an NHS, so they had alternative means. But we read the story of the perspective of one man who went for 38 years, day in, day out, to seek healing at this pool. This man was unwell for that length of time. The man was seeking some sense of change in his life. And it's described as the place called Bethesda, which is a name that has 2 connotations. One is that name is associated with hiddenness and disgrace and shying away from the world. But the other part of that name is associated with opportunity, with grace, with a change of lifestyle, with healing. And so it was apt that this was the place where the pool was, the place of Bethesda, by the sheep gate. And many people gathered there in hope that their lives would be turned around. In the Bible, there is verses 1 to 3, but then verse 4, strangely, is missed out, and we jump straight to verse 5. But in some manuscripts of the Bible, it is included. I don't know whether it is in yours, but it says this: the unwell people waited for the movement of the waters. From time to time, an angel of the Lord would come down and stir up the waters. And the first one into the pool after such a disturbance would be cured of whatever disease they were experiencing. But the perspective of this man, and we read in verse 7 a little bit about the stirring of the waters, is that as people gathered around, they were desperate to get into the water as it stirred, in the hope that it would bring healing to their lives. People went in, and perhaps there are stories of a miraculous change. We just don't know. But the man who was there for 38 years was hoping to go into that water, but never could. In fact, we read that he'd been waiting for those number of years, lying there, and Jesus says to him, "Do you want to get well?" And he replied, "Sir," which is a sort of a way of respecting Jesus. He says, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes ahead of me." What is the most dramatic thing here is that the man is completely on his own. He is isolated. There is no one there to help him. As someone said, perspective is everything when you are experiencing the challenges of life. This man, for 38 years, the challenge of his physical condition meant that he was desperate for a change in circumstances. But although he was close to the water in the hope that the water would bring him healing, no one was able to take him there. Perhaps greater than his physical challenge was that sense of being in complete isolation and being alone. No friend, no support, no companion. That's the real tragedy in this story from the perspective of the man. But there is not a sense of hopelessness, because Jesus, in the midst of everything that's going on around, notices the man and acts in a way that the water couldn't. So we move on to the second perspective. This is the perspective of Jesus. Jesus is in Jerusalem for the feast. We don't know what feast is being celebrated in Jerusalem. It could be the feast of Passover, the moment when the Jewish people celebrate liberation from slavery, from Egyptian slavery. It could be a feast, a celebration of Pentecost, the giving of the law on Mount Sinai to Moses and how that guided the people of God. It could be the celebration, the feast of harvest, giving thanks for the provision of God for the food and resources for people. We just don't know what the celebration is, but crowds have gathered in Jerusalem and there's much excitement and anticipation about all that celebration means. But Jesus moves in his own perspective away from the circus of celebration and towards the periphery of pain. When everyone else is scurrying around and getting excited about celebration, Jesus gravitates to the place that is hidden, the place of vulnerability, the place of need, the place that is considered as a segregated place for outsiders and for the forgotten. But what's going on here is that Jesus is acting and seeing and working in a way that his Father acts and sees and works. In verse 17, a little bit after the passage that was read, Jesus says, "My Father is at work, always at his work to this very day, and I too am at work." Jesus was acting in the way in which God acts. Jesus was seeing in the way in which God sees. And he saw the man lying there, and he learnt about his condition. He took interest in the man. He struck up a conversation asking more about his situation. And he drew near. For Jesus, it wasn't the celebration or the Sabbath that was the priority. It was the condition and needs of the man. Jesus came to bring healing and hope for the downcast and the forgotten and those who are rejected. We read about that in Luke 4, the manifesto, if you like, the beginning of Jesus' ministry, which is such a crucial part to understanding who Jesus is and why Jesus came to the world. And Jesus asked a very simple question: do you want to get well? It's an obvious question. And he knew that it was a courageous question too, because he knew it was a question that would upset the religious leaders of the day. Because in Jewish law, you should not work, you should not heal on the Sabbath, but Jesus was doing just that. Jesus took interest in the man. That was his perspective. He spoke with authority to the man by saying, "Get up, pick up your mat and walk." And at once the man picked up his mat and he was cured and he walked. In one sense, this is all very matter of fact in the scriptures, in the way in which it is described. But because it happened on the Sabbath, there is this sense of the authority of Jesus coming through and saying, "I am Lord of the Sabbath." It's an amazing moment. Jesus' perspective as the one who acts and works and sees the way in which God acts and works and sees is what is happening here. Jesus speaks and lives are changed. A bit like when God spoke at the very beginning of creation and the world, the sea, the skies were all formed. New things emerged. So here, with the authority of Jesus, lives are transformed and new beginnings emerge. This is an incredible moment. The perspective of Jesus, away from the crowds, towards those who are forgotten, those who are isolated, those who are in need, and he brings hope and healing of companionship and friendship and renewal. We move now to the third perspective, and this is the perspective of the Jewish authorities. Up until now, John's Gospel in chapters 1 to 4 has been describing Jesus' encounter with people in a way where there is the miraculous and there is the accepting. There is the acceptance of those who want to follow Jesus. There is the miracle of the turning of the water into wine at the wedding in Cana. There is Nicodemus, the theologian, the learned man who wants to know more about Jesus and be seeking Jesus out. And there is the Samaritan woman in the previous chapter, and Jesus, as they share a conversation, as Jesus breaks down barriers, and she, for being a Samaritan and being a woman, but Jesus treats her with equality and dignity. Until this moment, everything, in one sense, has been peaceful. But here we come to a moment where there is conflict. In verse 10, the Jews said to the man who was healed, "It is the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat." Now, in the Jewish law, you can actually heal on the Sabbath, but only after sundown. And so they were saying, surely, if you're going to be healed, you've been like this for 38 years, wait until sundown. Who healed you? This is against the law. And that question of who healed you is a question that raises tension, because to be acting in a way that is counter to the Jewish law is not just something that is unlawful, but it's something that describes an act that breaks the covenant with God. It just disrespects God from a Jewish perspective. God set up a covenant relationship defined by the giving of the law. And so Jewish people keep in step with the law in order to please God. So anything done outside of the law is considered displeasing to God. So here comes Jesus, and he acts in a way that is beyond the law, that is above the law, but it brings healing and freedom to the man. The Jewish authorities at that time didn't see the freedom given to the man. Instead, they were seeing the breaking of the law, the breaking of the covenant, the disrespect shown to the God who gave the law and the covenant. So really, as the tension grew and as conflict emerged, what is created here is a sense where the man has to recognise the perspective of who Jesus is, and the Jewish authorities are beginning to recognise all that Jesus is about. The question is whether they respond to that sense of the way in which Jesus acts and consider Jesus to be acting in the same way that God acts, or not. It is a challenge to the perspective of the Jewish worldview, the religious rituals. Jesus acted in a way that was outside their normal practice, and it caused huge offence for them because of the breaking of the Sabbath. And their perspective is to stop or to deny the work of Jesus. As someone said, any time people venture into the unknown, there is a cost. And Jesus was venturing into a way, or acting in a way that was breaking new ground and changing perspectives. But the cost of that was to cause confusion, perhaps, or certainly rejection from those that wanted to stay in the normal pattern and behaviour of things. This story is about Jesus breaking through and breaking beyond religious custom to show a new freedom, a new way, a new possibility. But from the perspective of the Jewish authorities at that time, there was a questioning, because there was a denying of what Jesus was doing and who Jesus was. Finally, I just want to conclude or finish by just focusing upon the last couple of verses. Jesus re-enters the scene and takes the initiative to find the man in the temple. That's what it says in verse 14. And Jesus says, "See, you are well again," which is a wonderful affirmation of what has gone on. But then he says a strange thing. He says, "Stop sinning or something worse may happen to you." And I want to just clear something up here. It's not that sinning is connected to his disability, as if the consequence of his sinful life is his disability. That is not what is being said here, and I want to make sure that there's clarity about that. Rather, in John's Gospel, the word sin, or the verb to sin, it occurs in chapter 9 as well. And it's actually about sort of the sense of not being able to see well. It's sort of spiritual blindness, that sense where the perspective that you have in life is covered over, and that's what sin is. It's seeing things in a way that's not true. And here Jesus has healed the man physically, but more so has enabled the man to see and have a perspective on who Jesus is and the life he can have in believing in Jesus, in following Jesus. It's not just that his physical life has been changed, but his way of seeing and looking has been transformed. Now I know who Jesus is. And so when Jesus says stop seeing, he means go on living your life and don't revert back to seeing in a way that causes blindness to who I am. I am the Son of God, the Saviour of the world, and now your eyes, your heart, your mind has been opened to that. Carry on living in that way. So that's what sinning means in John's perspective. It's about that sense of not seeing who Jesus is. But not to sin means that you're now seeing who Jesus is. And the invitation for all of us is to open up our eyes, our minds, our hearts, and to have a perspective in knowing who Jesus is, the one who comes to each of us who are alone, that we may be invited in to a sense of belonging. We all need healing from isolation to a place of belonging into the heart of God.